Welcome everyone to the Healthy Landscapes Practical Regenerative Agricultural Communities webinar tonight, focusing on ecological burns, the benefit with Martin Roberts from Macedon Ranges Shire Council. As a starting point, I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which you are watching this or watching this recording. I wish to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. For me, I'm on Jaja Wurrung country, and definitely like to acknowledge their custodianship. I also wish to acknowledge the funders for the Healthy Landscape program, which has encouraged Martin to be part of the presentation, which is the Macedon Ranges Shire Council, Melbourne Water, Hepburn Shire Council, the City of Greater Bendigo, Healthy Colburn Catchment, which includes the Colburn Water and North Central CMA, and the Upper Campaspe Landcare Network. Please use the chat feature, as most of us are aware how to use these things now. Please use the chat feature to ask questions throughout the presentation. And if I see a common theme coming through those chat features, I'll ask Martin to pause and explain something if it's unclear. Otherwise, we'll leave those questions until towards the end of the evening at the question and answer stage. So I expect this presentation to be about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session that will be recorded. And then for those of you joining us, there'll be an unrecorded session after that, which we will give the people that have joined us live the opportunity to ask questions. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Martin.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks everybody for tuning in tonight. I'd also like to start by just acknowledging traditional owners. I'm on Taunurung country, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and also any other Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people who might be with us tonight and exploring this sort of really interesting space. I'm just going to share my screen and I'll start. I've got a presentation tonight. Hang on a sec. Before I do that, I'll just make sure I've got my presentation good to go. So yeah, I put together a bit of a presentation, and I'm going to take you through that now. Just want to make sure the audio is set up, which it is, and I'll start the slideshow. So thanks again for everybody for tuning in. So I work pretty closely. I'm the Bushland Reserves Officer for Macedon Ranges Shire Council, and I work with Jason as part of the environment team. And I part of what I do is I'll plan and conduct, coordinate ecological burning, and increasingly I'm involved in the cultural burning space, or the traditional owner burning space, which is fascinating space to be involved in, and I'm really keen to support it as well as ecological burning. But the presentation tonight is predominantly going to focus on ecological burning because that's what kind of I'm more familiar with, and it's not really appropriate for me to speak about cultural burning because I'm not a traditional owner. But I thought firstly we'd start with just a bit of a breakdown of what I suppose just some clarity around what ecological burning is, what cultural burning is, and what fuel reduction is, because they can get mixed up, and they are very definitely fuel reduction is very distinct from what we do. There's going to be slides in this. I'm going to focus primarily on what we're doing in the local government space, specifically at Macedon, and then there's going to be some slides. I'm going to take you through some of the process that we have, but I'm not going to dwell on it. So there's going to be areas of focus in some of the slides, which I'll talk to more specifically. And then we're going to transition into a bit of things you might need to think about, or you'd like to explore around if you were thinking about doing any burning in your space or on your properties within your context. This is the things that I think would be valuable to be thinking about and focusing on. So ecological burning, we're really like the primary focus is about trying to achieve an ecological outcome. So what is the objective is needs to be stated pretty clearly at the outset, and that's what we try and look to use a burn to deliver. There's obviously, and in the traditional space, there's a whole range of things that a burn has historically been used for, or that it might be used for in an adapted space in the current context. But I think you could summarise it: right burn in the right place at the right time is how it's sort of been put to me. And then fuel reduction is it's coming from a very risk mitigation space, and it can do that, and also can increase risk too if obviously it gets out, or if it stimulates too much growth in the subsequent years as well. So yeah, question mark over fuel reduction burning, I think, is probably reasonably appropriate. But as I said, it's not appropriate for me to speak to cultural burning or traditional owner burning. So I'm going to just run this clip. We worked with Wurundjeri Wurrung at its daily nature reserve burn, and part of that was developing a bit of an education piece because we were getting increasing requests for either cultural burning to be undertaken or requesting that some more information about it. So we went through this with Wurundjeri, and so I'm just going to play it now. As I said, it's more appropriate that this is Uncle Dave speaking, and this will hopefully in the near future be on the council website as well, so we can direct people to that. But I just wanted to touch on this before we get into the ecological burning component. And I'm really hoping people can hear the audio.
Cultural fire is right fire for right country at the right time. It's burning for country. It's not actually burning for our safety, like our personal safety. It's burning for the safety of the country. So in a modern context, we're burning for biodiversity. Nature to us is the spirit of our mother. The land is our mother. And just as she cared for us when we were young, and we return the favour when she gets old, that's our physical mother, we look at country the same way. And she is very old and she is very sick and she needs a lot of care. When you've got an unhealthy system, the whole rest of the circle, so those animals, birds, bees, soil, all those sort of things start to collapse. And that actually affects me spiritually, because as a traditional custodian, under Bunjil's law, our creator Bunjil, the wedge-tailed eagle, it is our responsibility not just to care for ourselves, but to care for all of those systems. The reality of a cultural fire is we never actually burnt the bush. All we did was keep the forest floor clean. And if you can do that and you get the ash layer that comes from that by producing the right smoke which feeds the trees, which if you've got healthy trees, you have healthier grasses underneath. You have the right kind of grasses, which means the animals actually thrive, they can actually breed better. And it creates this whole healthy ecosystem. And that was important to us because that ecosystem was our supermarket. It was our chemist. It was our Bunnings. You know, we relied on it for food, for shelter, for clothing, and for medicine. So for all of those reasons, you apply a burn. You hear people talking about the dream time and stories and creation and all those kind of things. But in actual fact, we were scientists. And we've had thousands and thousands of years to observe the Australian landscape. You know, we've collected data over thousands of years that's still being passed down. And that law, through our oral history, gets passed down from elder to elder to elder, who passes it on then to his family or his broader community. When I do go out and do a burn, it's like, okay, I do check on the day, the wind, the weather. You feel the humidity yourself. It's checking the soil moisture. It's doing a little test patch, watching which way the smoke goes, watching the colour of the smoke. The colour of the smoke is very important. you should be able to walk with the fire, and you should be able to walk in the fire. Now that fire's there as my friend. I'm working with it, and it will behave the way I want it to, if I respect it, I understand it, to make it do what I want to do. We need to walk country together, and we can heal country together. And once we heal country, we actually start healing ourselves as people.
So I'm just going to stop it there because it's just a little bit of a promo going forward. Yeah, love that. Came up really good. Very happy with the burn on the day, and obviously the footage that they were able to get, because it really does capture that really important subject for traditional owners. So yeah, the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be looking at sort of more of the space that I've worked in for the last sort of 15, 18 years. And I'm going to talk to the sort of the outcomes. So, and the benefits of the burning that I've seen and that I've been involved in. So, and this is the local government. So as you can probably all appreciate, local government is a bit of a bureaucratic beast. This is the 5th council I've worked in, and where we've been implementing sort of a planned burn program. And so the things I want to sort of point out from these two images, they're in exactly, these 3 images, is they're in exactly the same location. So the bigger picture beyond is the same, and the pictures in the foreground, they're what the site was like before, and then a year after, or the following spring, it's what the site looked like after the fact. So we had a site that was long unburnt, and in this space, this is in the wood end grassland, it is long unburnt, was about, I think, 7 or 8 years since it had had an ignition in this area. And you can see that the grass, we had a lot of thatch build-up in that space. But when you've been able to reintroduce an ignition in this space, you start seeing some of this diversity coming back. And the diversity you can see in this space is there's all that orange is grey parrot pea, and right through there it's just an orange haze. Up in the left corner, that white you can see is milkmaids, the lily that's come up after that, and this is the abundance and the diversity that is in that space, and is very much it is promoted by fire, but it's also a result of burning in this space and previous management, going back thousands of years as well. So why do we burn in local government? Well, and especially the ecological burning space, it's really about trying to achieve an optimum outcome in an area. So we are looking to increase abundance and diversity. So it's diversity of species, but it's also abundance of opportunities for insects and invertebrates, small mammals, if they exist still in the site, birds, but it's also an opportunity for pollinators as well, and breeding opportunities. A lot of insects require fresh growth to lay eggs. They don't particularly like thatch or use thatch at all. So, stimulating new growth on plants provides opportunity for nectar feeding and for laying eggs and promoting sort of life cycles across a whole range of species. So the benefits of ecological burning, we workshopped this a little bit on our team before this presentation, and really, whilst I'm going to be speaking about the process and council achieves this, these are some observations I've had over time regarding the ecological burning in this and what it can achieve. So as you can see from those other images, it really removes biomass and I said that can stimulate growth to provide up other opportunities for other species, but also increases the intertussock space, which is pretty critical. So the grassland and grassy woodlands, which we predominantly burn in and apply fire in, this is pretty critical. So you've got your structural grasses, and they may be summer or winter growing, and maybe this relates to pastures you've got in your farming context, and where you find the diversity is in the tussock spaces. But those deep-rooted perennials, they really help to drive the soil structure as well. So they're also helping with moisture infiltration to the soil profile. They're providing some structure in that space. Ecological burning, like when you achieve a good ecological burn, it should be quite patchy, to the point where you're not burning off all your green tips, and that site will actually start growing the next day or in the next week. Especially if rainfall, you'll see that it starts to bounce back quite quickly, and that's quite critical for cover for any critters that are running around in that space, that they've got some protection from predation. And the site recovers relatively quickly. You get that new growth coming on. It promotes, I've said, native plant germination. Everyone's probably pretty aware of that. What people probably aren't aware is, and Uncle Dave touched on this as well, is the importance of the smoke. So there's chemicals in this plume of smoke that just precedes the fire, and that is predominantly what is breaking the inhibitors and stimulating germination of native seed in that space. Often when we think about burning, we think, oh, it's got to be hot because it's got to open the seed up, or it's got to open the ground up, or it's got to open the seed pods. Like if you got seed pods on a tree, yes, a bit of heat underneath will help to dry them out. They may drop and they may open and release seed, like with eucalypts and the woody fruits. But it's this smoke that just is in that plume that just moves very gently ahead of a fire that is so important for germination. And that can only be achieved in a really kind of cool but slow burn. If you're running a fire through a landscape, and that's what most people think of when they think about burning, is they think about running fire, because that's what they see on telly, and that's what they see in a summer in a bad situation. You get an ignition and it's just off and away it goes. You can light ignition patterns that do that, but they're not beneficial in that they are moving too quickly across that space and they're not creating the right smoke. So that's just something I've sort of observed, but I think is pretty critical, is understanding that when you're doing ecological burning, you're actually burning very slowly. You're not putting lots of ignition in, you're not putting a lot of accelerants in. You're really trying to put the brakes on and allow that natural propagation of fire to back very slowly in through an area. And that's what, and then, yeah, I said that is what achieves the effect you want. Just going to go to the next one. Why is it not working? Sorry about this. I'm not really sure why that's. Oh, there we go. Just click on that. Just going to use my mouse. So what does ecological burning not do? I've tried to really put this little text screen just quite low. So this is wood and grassland looking at the same burn from a different angle at the end. And also just noting the detailing of the fire breaks through here, which we can touch on, which I will touch on in the next few slides. But it doesn't, contrary to many people's assumption, it's not an effective tool for eliminating woody plants. And in this space, it's probably a good example because we have a lot of, it's a grassland, but I think it's a derived grassland, and it's probably anthropomorphic in origin. So it's really probably been created by people over a long period of time. And now we're starting to see that woody encroachment starting to move back in to the site, and burning isn't an effective tool for that. So it's not a silver bullet that's going to save all our sort of land management woes. Really wanted to put that to bed pretty early. A lot of people think that if you just put a burn in, everything's going to be brilliant and rosy again. Like it creates a vacuum and you can get a lot of weeds in that space straight up. It really depends on what is in the surrounding areas, what's in the seed bank. And you can use burning to really put an area back on a different trajectory and really start to target some removals in a way that is quite positive and doesn't you know, like when you've got an area it's been sort of burnt off and you're getting that regrowth, you can really do some targeted weed work without affecting other species. I've even had some areas out west full of Nacella, like Chilean needlegrass, and if you do a burn at the right time of year, you can almost take a boom spray through and knock out the Chilean straight up, because it's the first one to pop up and everything else is a bit slower to come through. So there are these windows of opportunity that can be created through doing the burning. But yeah, removing native veg or any woody veg is not exactly what's going to happen. You can control, or you can with targeted burns really start to affect some of the more annuals like annual grasses can be quite affected by it, and you can interrupt their seeding cycles and things like that. So you can get weed outcomes from it, or weed control outcomes or eradication from it. But yeah, it's a bit of a misnomer, the idea that you can just burn an area and all the woody veg will disappear and it'll be all open again. Also, just wanted to touch on gorse. This is a friend's property that I was just helping him out with a few stands. So this is the middle of winter. You can see from all around it's pretty green. We went through and mulched it right down. It's very hard to do an ecological burn with gorse, and there's other plants like this, but this is just a really good example. It's full of volatile oils. It's so aerated. It's so elevated. You can see the black smoke coming off that. It's not great. It's burning very hot, but it is, burning this hot will really open it up and will allow us to get in and do some good weed control after the fact. But yeah, as that comes around the bend there, it really does give off a lot of heat. So yeah, it is beneficial if you have got the opportunity and you can burn it in an open space, because as I said, you can stimulate the seed bank, which is desirable, and you can knock it out. So you can save yourself 20, 30 years of weed control by burning it out. But that kind of level of energy that's being released in that one event, so you really want to have a very controlled day to do that. You really want to make sure that it's very damp in and around it. Maybe you've got some rain on the way, or it's just rained and it's going to rain the next day. You're really always looking at those kind of 3-day patterns or more before you decide that you might want to light up anything. So yeah, if the conditions are right, you're looking really cold, preferably damp, with a high RH. I'll just speak to, if RH, people don't know what RH is. RH is relative humidity, and it's a really significant factor as with atmospheric stability. So looking at those nice flat clouds in the sky, no cumulus forming going up. You don't want upward air movement. You really want a really tight inversion layer to make sure that everything's going to not accelerate too quickly. And relative humidity has a lag effect of about 2 hours. So that's the rate of which organic matter will pick up moisture over the course of the day. So it's 2 hours past the peak temperature of the day, and it takes there's a lag effect, as I said, in organic matter starting to reabsorb moisture in that space. So you want to pick a day that's basically 70 or 80% relative humidity if you're burning gorse. You want it to be pretty high, basically think the middle of winter. And you want to have it really cleared around there. And yeah, some of the benefits there. I can't emphasize enough that probably the real benefit is really stimulating the seed bank. Sometimes people see that as a bit of a negative. It's like, oh, suddenly I thought I was getting rid of my gorse and then I've got millions of seedlings popping up. But as I said, that saves you years and years of follow-up spot spraying if you can germinate it all in one hit, and then it just drops out of the system and you can really start winning with it. So now to talk about the processes. And as I said, I'm not going to dwell on everything. This is recorded, and you can come back and pause the recording any time and just look through these lists.
Just a question, Marty.
Yeah,
it's a good point. So I'm sorry to interrupt straight away, but we did talk about gorse burning any of the root systems underground. Do you want to comment on that?
Oh yeah, well, it's probably good to just mention anything when you're burning too hot in that context. So it can be gorse, or it can be old stumps, or it could be something that's just like you might have groomed an area and there might be a bit of soil that's moved up and buried something. So when you're doing cool burning, as I said, it's literally just burning off the fine fuel, whether it be small leaf litter or whether it be thatch from grasses in that space. You really, as I said, burn it cool. And that and especially if you've got good soil moisture, when you're doing it, or the right soil moisture, you won't see fire go into the ground. Now, why is that an issue? It's the days after. So you might walk across a site, touch the ground and go, yep, this is nice and cool. We can go home now, we can go to bed. If you get a wind change and a gusty change and you've got, you've burnt so hot, or you've burnt an area that's hot, so you might have a cool burn overall, but you might have a gorse stand in it that's, or some other woody material in there that's been burnt through that. It might start burning in the ground, and unless you're checking that, it'll burn for days and days and days. You won't even know that it's burning. It might not put up smoke, and you'll just get a gusty change, and it'll start to go. Might happen in the middle of the night, and you don't even know it's there, and it's popped up and it's run away from you in that space. So yeah, it's a really good point, Jason. You really need to make sure that if you're burning through anything and it's going to be a hot burn, and you're going to try and avoid that. But you really want to check your logs, and preferably you want to exclude them as well. So I'll talk about that basically in prepping a site. But if all logs, all stumps, all hollows, they're all assets in this space. They're all really important for wildlife, whether they be small or large, and they're also important for the recovery of the space. So it's really important that you remove fuels around this by cutting around it or wetting it down when you're doing ignition, to make sure that these aren't going up and you're removing all these things. Most of what you're looking at in the ecological burn space is just removing some of that fine fuel. So yeah, thanks for the question, Jace. Hopefully I've answered that one for you. So to quickly run it through, and this is just to give you an overview of the, so we work in a fairly bureaucratic space, but we also try and make sure that that everything's organised and that everything's happening as we want it to. Our program is it's a living document. It's an evolving and a revolving program. So we just have a list of burns and sites that we'd like to do. As we're sort of developing, or as we're looking to create burn plans, we go out, we have a look at the site, we see what the potential is and what the benefit might be. We might start doing some tree hazard inspections, which are becoming more of the norm now. So walking around, looking up, looking down, looking around, seeing if there's any hangers or anything that might cause an injury on any given day, and you're trying to address that well in advance. Then we head into an ecological burning phase, which also includes looking at all the things you'd expect, like the conditions or the weather or the fuels. We might start thinking about resource requirements or as we start planning it. We're looking at stakeholders and if there's any lure. So currently we have 2 traditional owners with RSAs in place, which is recognition and settlement agreements. And where we have committee of management status on Crown land, there is an automatic requirement to send out these notifications that we intend to do this. But our position at council is that we're trying to develop relationships in and around that process that is really about being more inclusive and having those conversations just as the norm, not saying, oh, it's a requirement, but let's actually get out there and do that engagement and start building those relationships well in advance of anything happening. And then we can either explore, will it be a cultural burn or will it be an ecological burn, and what's the best fit on any given day. We'd also look at fire prevention if we need permits, if it's within the fire danger period. We don't generally do that. We tend to avoid that, but who knows with the weather going forward. We're having pretty wintry weather today, and technically the burn permit window is still in effect. So that's where we might look at permits. We'd go out and obviously have to prep the site, and as I said, they get prepped within an inch of their lives. We undertake notifications, so we install signs like boundary notifications. We send out letters to adjacent residents. Also, we look for anyone that might be impacted. So if there's nursing homes or schools or sporting clubs that might be impacted by smoke, we definitely engage them early and try and keep them in give them an overview of a potential time frame for window, and then we may even contact them on the day. Increasingly, we're also, we have to go through our rec team at council, our recreation team, because they've got all those contacts as well. Then we'll undertake the burn on the day, and there's a lot that happens with that. There's the briefing, there's the actual ignition itself, and then there's the after action review or post briefing. Then there's the blacking out, and then there's monitoring the site. And all through that, we're also looking at monitoring. So we might have sent up some monitoring plots or some photo points, and then we monitor those after the event So yeah, there's a bit in it. The burn itself is only a relatively small part on a particular day, but it can take weeks of sort of planning and prepping and looking and thinking and trying to feel our way through it to see if we end up doing it or not. This is what the actual program looks like in real simple terms, and I'm not going to basically spend too much time on it, but you can see that we basically just try and color code. So we have a listed area. We might, the size is very indicative of what might be involved and who might be needed to be notified. So a big one includes us really going out and making sure that we're getting, there's obviously a lot of prepping requirements for that. So we use this basically to track our progress. How are we going in getting ready for a burn? Are we anywhere near it? Definitely not for Malmesbury Common in the grassland in the north, but wood and grassland itself, yeah, we're getting closer. We're starting to get some of those assessments done, and we're getting to a point where we can kind of say, yep, it's good to go. Resourcing, we run with generally a hybrid model, but it's really fit horses for courses. Sometimes CFA might want to take a bit more of a lead on an area. As I said, we're looking to engage and partner with traditional owners in that space as much as we can, and much as they are willing to, and that might be something that they take full ownership of. Sometimes it's funding kind of driven as well. So we try and, if we can do a bit of the work ourselves, we can save ourselves a bit of money and we might get 2 burns up instead of 1. The burn plan looks like this. And yeah, it's basically a booklet. I have to thank Dale Smithyman for the format for this, but this is where we start to capture all information. So this burn plan is the burning process, the pre-burn assessment, the development of the plan. It's then the document that we run with on the day, and then it becomes a record after the fact. So as I said, I'll start running through and looking at some of these factors that was probably really relevant. I said, we've got a very detailed process. You may or may not want to run with a detailed process, but the things you really need to think about is your burn prescription. So we have there's burn thresholds with the FFDI or the Grass Fire Danger Index, which says that you cannot burn above these parameters because you're moving out of not even just a cool burn space, but you're moving into a dangerous space. The burn prescription doesn't have to be that. And I openly encourage that you dial it down and you go right below that that prescription. So you've got a ceiling to it, but then you're really trying to achieve an outcome with those those conditions, which are a lot more mild and a lot more easier to control. And then you've got documenting what your resources might look like is pretty important in that space. So if you do have a lot of woody material and you're not doing a lot of prepping, you probably want your resourcing to be up a little bit or have a bit more water available, because your blacking out could take quite a few hours. Generally speaking, if you're doing like a hectare, you might be able to burn that out in about an hour or so, maybe 2 hours, maybe 3 hours, depending on how slow you want to do it. Maybe longer, maybe really take your time over about 4 hours. But the blacking out, if you get it too hot, you could be there for double that time trying to make sure it's safe to leave. So just a consideration. So these are the ceilings I talked about. So you can't burn above these. You can, but you do it at your own peril. This has been driven by a lot of research and science around what can you easily contain, what's relatively low volatility, and that you've got some level of control over if you're really in these. If you go below, really dramatically below, above it, there's also an issue that you might not be able to get an ignition at all. But I'd be rather playing in that low end space where your ignition is a bit patchy and probably don't get the effect you were probably hoping for, than being at the other extreme where you're calling on assistance and you're threatening life and property. So that's something to consider about. But once again, these things are the key factors in a lot of what gives you that level of control. So going with lower temperatures, under 20 degrees is fine. Mid-teens, depending on how cured the site is great. Nice and slow and calm and easy to run with. Relative humidity, 50%. If you start getting down, if the relative humidity gets too low, it doesn't matter how green your site is, it'll burn because there's just no moisture in the plants or in the soil. So 50% is a really good midpoint. Above that, you can still burn. And that's fine as well, but it can be quite slow. And I would probably say, yeah, don't go much lower than that. And the wind speed as well is pretty important. The wind speed is pretty important too, because it's what we work against. So you're creating a backing fire. So you're either backing in a slope, but if you're on a relatively flat landscape like this grassland, a lot of grasslands are, you would put an ignition in if you were to do it, and you would work against that breeze. So that is, it's that the brakes are on the whole time. If you don't, and so to get that, so an anemometer is the device. It's, you know, people who go sailing or whatever have them. They basically, you know, they tell you relative humidity, dew point. They're a really good, nifty little device, but they're not necessarily cheap. But they're handy to have. The other thing you could use is what's called a Beaufort scale, so used by people who like to sail. Hence, there's knots in this, but it's a tactile thing. So you can look at the vegetation around you can feel it on your skin, and you can make it a fair assumption about what the wind is doing, and possibly a little bit of what the RH is, but more what the wind is doing in that space. Wind direction is important, obviously, because you need to back in or back that fire into the breeze, and to give yourself that control. But I just thought I'd include that, so if people want to come back and look at that or look it up, it's a really good thing to be familiar with. Yeah, as I said, like the kilometres an hour here, 6 to 12, wind felt on face, leaves rustle, vanes begin to move, so you have a weather vane. So we're talking very gentle breeze in that space, and anything that or below is quite good. If you're in a grassland, I would sort of probably avoid calm, because that means you can have a lot of anabatic winds and other things affecting your fire. So the heating of the land will change, and you might have variable wind conditions, and it's very hard to pick how to back a fire in a landscape where there's nothing to work against and nothing to use. You know, there's no aspect or elevation or anything. You can back down a slope, or you can back against a breeze. So you're really looking at some breeze is good, not too much is also good. Site preparation. So in the local government context and in Macedon Ranges, we don't tend to do mineral earth break. We don't tend to do plough breaks, I should say, because that's quite damaging, especially in a lot of the bushland or conservation reserves. What we do is we slash a break, we detail it, we remove the thatch. So the one on the left doesn't have a lot of thatch removed. If you are going to do it, don't resist the temptation to throw it into the burn area to clean it up. You're better to take it away or throw it into the unburnt area. You don't want build up of fuel on the edge of your fire line as you're trying to light it up or put an ignition in and then black it out as you go. On the left here, you can also see we do a bit of what's called a penetrating wet line. So instead of wetting the whole fire break, which is probably useless, wastes a lot of water and dries out too quickly, we do it like a jet right on the edge of the fire line, and that creates this kind of moisture differential. So as the fire backs into it, and you can see with the smoke, there's a bit of a stiff breeze really moving across that site and it's backing in. But as it gets up to that moisture differential or that wet line, it's got to heat it up to travel through it. So green breaks and slash breaks, that's the risk, is you get fire creeping across. But in this scenario, when you've got that penetrating wet line, it reaches that line and it self-extinguishes because it's got to dry it out. That humidity puts itself out. As I said, we run with a 3 metre width break on that. I mean, and they can be narrower depending on the context, but generally that's our average to go to. Otherwise, it becomes prohibitive in the level of prepping you ought to do. But if there is lots of issues with I suppose an area of what we call vulnerability or liability in that space, and we just really don't want it to go into some kind of acid, or that we want there to be no risk, we might do it a bit wider in there. The other options, and this is from Daly on the left as well, you could use the existing tracks and breaks and roads. Mineral earth is best. Obviously, you can't burn through an asphalt path. It also saves you a lot of work in prepping if you can identify those and use those. And on the contrasting to that, it's the cut the brake by hand. This is up in Whittlesea, and cutting it, with a rake hoe is a lot of hard work. But you may need to do this kind of work if you're in rocky country or whatever. But generally, it's avoided. I don't think I've done a mineral earth break with a rake hoe for many years, probably about 15 years. you can make better decisions and find better alignments without saving yourself the work. So getting back into the burn notifications or the burn plan, the main one I want you to focus on here, we have an extensive list that includes, senior executives, everything. And this is our checklist to make sure that we're letting everybody know. But the main one I've highlighted in yellow through there is Vic Fire. I can't stress this enough. Make sure you register, even if you're doing a bonfire, register your burn with Vic Fire. That goes on the log. And if there's any calls to the emergency services, all the CFA captains in that area have access to that, and they also have your contact details. So, if they don't, you don't want to be pulling people out of their jobs and away from their families unnecessarily. But if they don't have that information and someone's ringing a plume of smoke in the middle of the distance, it's all bells and whistles and away they go, and it's really inconvenient, especially if it doesn't need to be. So if you register it, you might get a call from the CFA captain saying, "Hey, look, I've had some calls. How's it going? I've had plenty of them." And then you can say, "Yeah, look, it's going as planned, but we've just hit a bit of a smoky patch," and that's probably what they're saying. And all good. Just let us know. It just keeps everything friendly and keeps everybody in a really good space. Please do that. We will also include a layout plan of this. So this plan, as I said, because it becomes a record of what happened, initially we might put these dots, which are ignitions. So we might be doing multiple ignitions. They're just indicative of that there is multiple spot ignitions. We're not doing, as opposed to there being like strip ignitions. So at the end of this, we would have gone through and said, okay, we've done an ignition here, and then we had a break, and then we did an ignition here. So there's only 2 ignitions on the day, and we only did this area. So we would correct this and edit it, so it shows what actually happened on the day as that record. But this is really important because, especially if it's a simple diagram, it helps to point out things of value that you want to protect. It tells you exactly where the burn is, and it really is a simple communication tool. If you happen to have a few people out helping you on a day, if you're doing one, it's really important that they understand where the ignition might be and where it's going to end up, and who's tracking what edge, keeping an eye on the fire behaviour. On that note, if you do an ignition, and it's very common for people to just watch the fire. If you're on a fire break, don't watch the fire. Keep one eye on the fire and keep one eye on the outside of the fire, because you're really looking out for spotting over that space and making sure it's burning off the edge, and you're not getting too distracted with how nice the flames look in that space. It's really, really common for that to happen, but you've got to be disciplined and be making sure you're looking and checking those areas where you might be getting a spot over. Grass doesn't tend to spot over, and it definitely doesn't spot over on days that are really amicable to cool burning. But it's just good discipline to have. In this section, we're moving into the actual briefing and the day itself. Once again, just wanting to highlight the burn prescription is there and everything's dot pointed. So we just do this as a last minute check to make sure everybody's familiar with what we're doing, how we're going to do it, and how we're going to communicate, which is really critical as well. So we're at ignition. This is from the wood end grassland burn. It's always good to do a test burn. So we do them really regularly. Pretty much every burn really is the first one. And we're anticipating if the fire behaviour from that ignition isn't what we expect, we would actually put it out. But from that initial ignition, you can tell a lot about how the rest of the day might unfold, or at least the next couple of hours. So I'm just going to play this for you and just take it in. That's pretty much it. Just a short bit of footage. I'm not sure if the audio came through on that. I don't know if it came through on mine, but hopefully you got it. But essentially you can see a couple of things just from observing the fire in that first ignition. You can see that the fire is bending away from the fuel. It's not bending into it. So the brakes are on, doesn't want to run. Flame height is relatively low. Smoke is pretty tolerable. You're just there and it's nice white smoke, and you're not finding, and it's just starting to very slowly move through that material. So I said, always resist the urge to speed it up. That can cause a lot of grief that you don't want. It's best just to put minimal ignition in and let it sort of do its thing naturally. And then what we do in this space is we would probably consolidate those edges as we move around. We want to make sure we can keep moving our water rigs around. So we might find that we do a little bit of ignition on the edge just to encourage it to burn out and keep burning into the direction we want. and then we'd black that out pretty much straight away. As soon as that's off the edge of the fire, we'd be looking to black that out within about a metre, and just so we can keep moving our resources along. Oops, I'll just turn that off and click that one. Throughout it, we're doing weather observations. So, burn controller or burn planner, burn controller would either take this, or they might delegate it to somebody to just every, if it's a big burn, you might want to do it every half an hour. We might just do one at the start, middle and end. It's up to you, but it's important that you do record, because if there's anything wrong, we get criticised in local government all the time for lots of different things. And if people have an axe to grind, it's really important we're documenting exactly what happened, so we can show that we were under the burn prescription, and we were definitely under the burn prescription threshold. Yeah, it's important. And then at the end, we have this post-burn review or after-action review. Some of the best ideas for improving burns have come out of this, when people have just finished and they sit down and they say, we didn't have enough lunch breaks, or it was really smoky on my edge and I don't like that, or it went really well, nothing to report. So you're on track. So essentially, we really want to know what worked well, what didn't work well, and we'll maybe include some burn photos in this just to document that. In that, as I said, we might talk about what we experienced. Was it patchy? What was the fuel like? Were there lots of trip hazards through it? Were you comfortable? Did you find that it moved around, or did it move pretty consistently? This top right one, I should say, was an area we spray cured. So whilst that looks quite dry, the plants were quite supple and green still. So it did burn, but it probably didn't burn as we were sort of hoping, but it was still a good outcome. And it definitely helped us to treat the annual exotic grasses that were in there, and had a big impact on the site. But it's not, spray curing is not something we normally do. But in this site, it provided an opportunity for us to try and burn an area when our fire breaks were literally just green grass. The bottom right is another one from Whittlesea. So we have lots of big red gums out there. And so we just came through before the burn, brush cut it down. And then as they were doing some spot ignition, someone came in with a backpack and just wet down around the root zone to protect that tree. And that's kind of how we got that nice protected zone around there. So how do you know if you've had a good ecological burn? And these are all from the daily burn as well, from the Wurundjeri burn and the NARP team. But there's some good photos that were taken this. So I wanted to include this slide because it's really indicative of the things you're looking for. So white smoke, as Uncle Dave said, is really good. And that's what we want to see. Shows that it's not burning too hot. And you're not burning through larger fuels in that. You're really just taking off some of that lighter fuels. And gently, sort of very gently opening that side up. These two critters were running around pretty much either after the burn. The flame had passed or just soon after. So it shows that the ground, that they weren't cooked, which is good. They were able to find refuge. So the burn moved quite slowly through that landscape to the point where the NARP team were also running around and rescuing some of the praying mantis. I had no idea how many praying mantis were in that site, but we were able to physically pick them up and move them to another site. The site was cool to touch, low flame heights. This site too was long unburnt. So as I said, don't necessarily look at this site as saying, oh, it's all burnt back and that's a good result. Like, it is a good result, but ultimately it would have been the next burn that we do after this, we would expect to try and get a little bit more green material in that. But it's always tricky when it's a long unburnt site and there's a lot of thatch. It's very hard to dial down the heat and the load that's coming through there. But as I said, that site had two ignitions, and they just peeled off the landscape beautifully. And yeah, the site's really recovering brilliantly from that. So I look forward to the next one. So that's all the formal council process. Hopefully it didn't, it wasn't too boring or too dry. But now I really wanted to sort of explore how you might do it and look at that in a simplified way, talk to some points around that. And I was sort of, in reflection, there's a few things about this that I think are important. And so if you were in the fire agency, you go off and do a lot of training and you try and build up experience, and you've got to go through a lot of sort of accredited processes. And that's mainly one of the main reasons for that is you're often walking into a site you've never seen. You've got to do some really detailed and accurate assessments of that to understand how do you reintroduce fire into this space, or how do you do an ignition and all that. And they're usually working at a much larger scale. But everybody here, you've either got an area of focus or interest. It might be your property. It might be something you might be involved in a friends group or something like that. And you've probably spent a lot of time on that. I just don't want you to undervalue what that means. So knowing a site intimately is really important, because you get to know its nuances over seasons. And, you know, you might be walking a spicy space and you might have done it for years, or a paddock or whatever, or a bit of the back part of your property, it's a bit of bush. And you're thinking, oh, maybe this will do for a burn. This could be beneficial to have a burn. But, you know, you really want to understand the site and you want to know it pretty intimately. So you want to walk it, and you also want to let it talk to you as well. It's hard to explain what that is, but if you've been working in the bush sort of long enough, you kind of get a sense of sort of a conversation you can have just by observing and taking in information. And that's kind of what I'm alluding to in that. It's a bit tricky to explain, but it's about knowing. I said, know your patch. You want to understand how water is held in the space. So when we think about water, we're obviously thinking about depressions or actual ponds or waterways. But if you've got, you know, deep-rooted perennial grasses and other plants in a site, there's soil in the moisture. And this is, you know, relating, if I was talking about in a more technical term, you'd be thinking about the drought index and how long since rain and how much rain. But we're really, when you know this, your own patch, you kind of know how it holds water. And also it's about knowing the vegetation, because, you know, in a site like this where you've got a lot of Thermidor, which is summer growing, or, you know, kangaroo grass, you know, the summer rainfall events are having a massive impact on whether or not we could even burn this site, because they're actively growing, which means the plants are actively holding moisture. And there might not be a lot of thatch to override that that moisture in the plants. You'd have to pick a really specific day, and it might be a really specific window. It might be an hour in the day where, you know, you're dry enough to get a little bit of ignition in. Then after that, everything, all the moisture picks up and it puts the brakes on and puts itself out. It can go like that. But you also want to be really familiar with, you know, where you might have ladder fuels. So where you've got shrub layers connected to upper canopy, or where there might be a deeper, you really want to go and scratch around and have a look and see what you know, if you've got leaf litter falling on an area, underneath that leaf litter is what's called duff, and it's a small organic matter as it's slowly breaking down. You might have some rain and think it looks great, and it's all damp on top. When you scratch around, you'll find it's quite dry underneath. That's pretty critical to understand, is what depth does the moisture go to, because that can be whether that can be, well, it is a hugely defining thing whether you light up at all or not. If it's deep and it's dry in the ground, I would suggest that you definitely don't light up at all, even if it looks reasonably damp. Yeah, dewy nights. If you're doing a small patch, you can. There's been some burns I've done where I've lit up in the afternoon, usually around 4 o'clock or 3 o'clock, and you're burning down a slope, and the dew level picks up and it just self-extinguishes. You can't get it to go any lower on the slope. So you can use that atmospheric moisture and that cycle that happens over the course of a day to really sort of, you know, assist with your resourcing and making sure the extent of your burn stays within your parameters. So it's just a point I wanted to make too. The extent of your burn, there's a lot of stuff that can happen in a burn, but you've got your fire breaks, and you might have one or two secondary fire break or whatever. It hasn't gotten away from you until it's gotten out of that break. But if at any point you feel uncomfortable with the volume of fire or the fire activity or the way it's moving or the speed it's moving, don't wait till it gets outside of your fire break. Make a call. You should be already in contact with your CFA captain. You should have probably given them a call before you lit up, and just say, hey, you know, that burn I was told you I was going to do, we've had a bit of a go, but we've had a wind change. We're just not comfortable with how quickly it's moving. Any chance you could send a tanker out? We just want to put it out. I'll tell you what, they would be more than happy to come out on any given call like that, just to make sure they're not getting everybody else out of bed or off a job, to get with something that's running away from you and making you feel uncomfortable. That's a really good call to make. But just with this slide, yeah, what do you start with when you're trying to think about resource? Well, I would start with, imagine you have nothing and you've got bare feet, and you've got to really start thinking about what kind of fire would you create if that's the space you want to have. You don't want it to be too hot. There's a criticism of, I think it's fairly accurate to some degree, when you wear too much excessive fire gear out in the fire ground, it makes you, it warps your sense of the experience, and it can also make you're a little bit more ambitious with what you might try and burn, because you're actually not feeling and sensing the extent of the heat. Like those propane treated coveralls and whatnot are really quite good at keeping you pretty comfortable, but they do change the way you experience a fire. And yeah, having that level of exposure. I said, I'm not saying don't use safety gear, of course use safety gear, but the emphasis I'm trying to make is start with this idea that you don't have anything, and you really want to be able to then build and understand your resourcing from that point based on any given day as well. That, you know, where the conditions might be what you want and what you need. So try and see the whole burn in your mind. It's really important to understand why you would start a burn in a certain location and where you ultimately want to finish it, because that way, if it starts to move where you don't want it to move, you can put a bit of an ignition in and encourage it to go back another way, and just gently walk it back to where you want. It's quite straightforward to do if you've got a good conditions on a good day, and it's obviously burning very slowly. But yeah, start with that. Where do you want to start? Where do you want to end? Try and understand, you know, like even simple things like if you've got pumps of water, what is your rate of water that's coming out? So it's simple, run your pumps, put them in a tank, put it in a bucket and see how much water you get over a minute. Because if you're running your hoses all the time and you're putting heaps of water out, your tank is not going to last the job. And in that, you'd want to have a contingency to say, okay, if we are going to put out a lot of water, do I have a neighbour or a friend who's got another water unit that might want to come in behind and allow that resource to then move on, get filled up and then come back, so you're paying basically leapfrog in that space. That way, maybe, you know, if you've got a good fill point that's not too far away and you can quickly fill up, and, you know, that can be a way in which you can manage the amount of resources you might have on site. You might want to have a static at some point. You might want to bring out an old water tank, you know, 5,000 litre water tank, and just plonk it in the paddock, fill it up, and just in case you get the chance to come out and burn, and then that can be your fill point. Yeah, think about your resourcing and how will you back the fire. Are you using the slope? Are you using a breeze? Preferably, are you using both? So you're backing down a slope and into the breeze, and that will give you a lot of control. And understand what success will look like, because that will help you temper your this feeling you might have of like, oh, I've got to put a bit more burning because it's not burning clean enough. Like if the conditions are and it's burning nicely and calmly, don't, as I said, resist that urge to put more in to finish at a certain time or be out of there. If you're not achieving the burn in the area you want to do and the day is closing out, people want to move on, put it out and just come back another day. You've got your fire breaks installed, check it during the night just to make sure it is out. You don't necessarily have to suddenly put a heap of fire in and run a heap of fuel out just to, you know, achieve that objective. It's really hard. I get that, because, like, you know, you've spent your months and months prepping a site and planning it. You've got this idea about where you want it to fin. You've imagined it, visualized it in your mind, but at the end of the day, you know, you don't want people to be too tired, and it's only going to do what it's going to do. So, yeah, you've got to be realistic about what you can achieve, and if the conditions change or for whatever reason, don't feel worried about putting it out early. So yeah, what are the burn objectives, which is trying to bring it up to a close now. So what am I protecting? What am I promoting? What are my vulnerabilities? Where are my liabilities? Where are my vulnerabilities? Where are my liabilities? And how are these going to all come together to deliver the burn objective that I want? So you might be protecting natural assets. You might be wanting to burn around your house and just keep a little bit more reduced fuel around your house. You might be wanting to promote native germination. You might be wanting to promote weed germination, so you can do the control. Vulnerabilities are where you might be burning up. You're trying to do a bit of flat land, but it comes up to the edge of a slope. You've got a fire break in place, but you really don't want it popping over and running up that slope, especially if you can't chase it. So the vulnerability might dictate, instead of having one water rig, you've got two on that edge, and you've just got somebody patrolling it or somebody walking it with a backpack, just keeping eyes on it whilst the rest of the burn is going in another direction. You need to make sure you've got people on for that, and that's part of your contingency planning. So key components, I think this is the second last slide, and we can jump into Q&A. So know your patch and have a clear objective. I think I've covered and hammered that enough. Communication is critical. So register with VicFire, talk to your neighbours, talk to CFA. And also, how will you communicate on the day? In our burn plan, if it's small enough, we might just get away with a verbal communication. If it's like a 10 by 10 metre patch or whatever, and it's a really controlled site, we might just say, look, your radios are a little bit excessive. We'll have them on us, but we won't necessarily need to do it. Just talk to each other. You can obviously just do small burns. There's nothing wrong with doing small patches, but you might need to scale it up, and you could use mobile phones as a backup or as the main source on a day if you're sort of going to be pretty far apart. Yeah, so how are you going to communicate? And if you're on a channel and it's a busy channel, how are you getting past that truck chatter? Because obviously most people, we're not agencies, so we don't have closed channels. So you're inevitably going to get some interesting person on the other end of the line who wants to contribute. What's your process for changing channels and making sure everybody's on the right channel? It's important. So understand field weather topography, understand your role. It's really important to be clear about what you're there to do to make it all come together. Use the moisture differentials, add them, moderate fuels. So add water in where you need to, change the fuels if you need to. I've got in here candling trees. It's a bit of an art form, candling trees. So I just put it in there because you can go in through winter and start charring off the barks of trees, but I wouldn't encourage you just to necessarily start doing that. Hook up with your CFA if they've got any experience in it or whatever, and or maybe do it in a really controlled mowing space first to get some feel for it. But obviously the fire is going up a tree, so you really want to make sure you're raking around those trees and removing a lot of fuel, and you're just burning the bark like a little bonfire underneath. But yeah, I've just put it in there because some people might know about it, some people might not. But it's a good way of sort of preparing an area where you just want to burn out the fuels on the ground or the material on the ground. You can go through and do some pre-work that will stop it going up the trees if you're in that kind of environment. Have detailed fire breaks, have lots of them, put them through your burn if you need to. So don't feel like you've just got to have a perimeter fire break and that's it. If you cut them through your burn, you've got options of pulling it up early and just doing a patch or running it to a line if it's not going your way. You can burn off that edge and just sort of finish it up pretty quickly and away you go. So yeah, have a lot of breaks if you've got time to resource it. I think that'd be a good idea. Resourcing before, during and after. So how are you going to prep the site? How are you going to run the burn? But after, we talk about stable conditions. You really want to make sure that you've got, probably if you can, it's getting harder and harder, but 3 days of stable atmospheric conditions. And you want to be checking that the day after. That night, if you're burning it during the day, check it that night, check it the next morning, check it over the next couple of days. Scale, be small or start small. Definitely start small, definitely don't start big. Build on your experience, don't be ambitious, just be realistic. So just keep everything in a zone you feel comfortable and listen to your gut in that space. If fire behaviour is not making you feel comfortable and not making you probably feel a bit bored, then make sure you can put it out at that point. Backing fire only. Look, there are other ways of lighting, but essentially in this scenario, you should only be considering a backing fire because that's what gives you most control. And you can always come back another day. Yeah, don't feel like pressured. Don't ever feel pressured. If you did all this work and you're like, oh, I want to do this burn. If you show up on the day and it's not right, don't light. Yeah. So communication is everything with burning. Document everything, whatever level of documentation you want to do. But it'd be, it's important to document because if something goes wrong, you want to make sure that you can explain to whoever's asking you those questions in a very serious way, what planning you put into it, what you did, like how you resourced it, what you were hoping to achieve and why you chose the day you chose. And try and network and learn from others. And that's it for the formal presentation. Any burning questions?
Thanks, Marty. I've got a few questions here. So as I've put in the chat, if you could put your questions into the chat, that'd be great. One from Elsie. Do you involve DELWOP and Fire Farm and the management of the Crown land sites?
Generally, no. Mainly because, and this is more historical in my experience, they're just not available. I know that there's a lot more work that's been done around joint management and joint operations and people working together. So I'm not saying that that won't happen in the future. But ultimately, you could go on a schedule, and most of what we do in that space is just not, it's not big enough, or it's not strategic enough to justify a prioritisation for DELP. And so hence we've started filling in some of the gaps, doing some of this work in local government.
Okay, the next one is from Jennifer. Are sites pre-checked for any nesting fauna, as well as checking any hollows in trees for fauna?
Good question. We do a walkthrough. Yeah, we do have, like, part of the planning is we'd be identifying trees of significance. So if they're large trees with hollows, that would be something we would keep any ignition away from. If there's nest boxes in the area, we'd be checking those nest boxes to see if they're occupied. There's a lot of nest box monitoring that happens here as well. So we might already have data on that, and that would influence whether we even light up in an area. But you can only check what you can check. And yeah, essentially, we would just look to try and create a burn that is, as I said, quite manageable and cool. As I said, you can see from some of those images I included that skinks were running around in this burn pretty much straight away after the burn. And there just wasn't the heat load. Like even with that image you could see there, you could walk back a couple of meters off that and put your hand on the ground, and it just really hadn't cooked the ground at all. It was quite, I wasn't so cool to touch, but the ground was warm, but it wasn't over the top. So yeah, just focusing on trying to dial down the intensity of that fire means you can obviously have less of an impact on wildlife. And yeah, they tend to roll with it pretty easily. People always say, oh, snakes issue. I've never seen a snake at a burn. They get whiff of it and they're gone. Everything else seems to be the same. It's more the small insects and invertebrates that can't get away very quickly, or can't go to ground very quickly, or they don't want to go to ground at all. And that's kind of one of the reasons why we try and burn slowly, to give them an opportunity to just stay ahead of the fire front, stay out of the way. You can see them moving through the grass and keeping out of the way. So, yeah.
Probably more a comment than anything else from Greg is cut your break early to give it a chance to green up before you burn.
Excellent suggestion, Greg. Yes. Yeah.
Jade says, how do you control the temperature of the burn?
It's interesting. We put little data recorders in one burn up in Malmesbury, and just two little digital recorders, and it wasn't even hot enough to really register. Earth is a really good insulator, so basically 5 or 10 mil under the ground, especially with this type of burning, cool burning, however it's delivered, it's really yeah, quite cool. So one of the things you've got to do is, as I said, you avoid multiple ignitions as much as you can, because where you get increased fire intensity is where two fires meet at the what calls junction zones. So if you do lots of, or if you're running a line of fire and you're making a fire reach its maximum potential all in one hit, and you're running fuel out, and fuel's creating an unnatural sort of fire intensity in that immediate location. But the junctions, so if you burn one bit, you say, I'm going to burn it this other bit, inevitably when those two fires meet, they will suck into each other and they will increase intensity, and that's where you're most likely going to get spotting. Even from grasses, you can get a little bit of upward movement because you're starting to create convection, and that will lift burning material off the ground. So yeah, really, really patchy ignitions is probably a good way to go. Obviously, agencies will do different things in that space and for different reasons. But I'm just trying to really think of the target audience here after speaking to Jason, because it seems to be, this is obviously on the back of the regen focus and the land management focus. So I'm not going to really speak to other stuff that's a bit more technical. I really want to keep it simple. That's probably the best thing.
So it's about controlling the burn, the temperature is just that one or two sites. They're not creating its own weather pattern, and the amount of fuel obviously has a huge bearing on how
you can always, and I said, I talked about moisture differentials before, about putting some water on the edge to sort of bring the fire up naturally, just it self-extinguishes. But yeah, you can always, like, there's plenty of times where you'd be on an edge And you ask the people who are doing the wet lining or doing that suppression activity, or how comfortably, and they're like, oh, it's getting a bit hot here. Just give it a sprinkle. Just dampen it off. That takes the heat load out straight away, and everything starts to calm down. And it's a little quick squirt, and away you go. If you've got nozzles, if you're using adapted spray equipment, some people just use, you cleaned out your spray rigs and you're using sprayers, you can adjust the nozzle to more of a mist, and you can create that. So you wouldn't use mist to do suppression, but if you wanted just to dial down the temperature of the fire edge where you are, you can do that. So there's things you can do.
On average, how many people do you need on the ground on the day?
This is a good question. The multi-billion-dollar question. How many people do you have? In my experience, and we talked about this a little bit as a team as well, if you're doing a hectare or less, and I'd say a lot less, depending on the situation, if it's relatively simple landscape, you can see each other, you can talk to each other. So, when we talk a hectare, it's 100 metres by 100 metres, and you've got good conditions. You could have one person on each fire line tracking the edge of the fire, one burn controller, and you might have somebody there doing weather or engaging, just being there as a point of contact or doing observations or whatever. So, and one ignition. So that's 5. So yeah, one ignition, one on each wet line, burn controller. All they're doing the whole time is watching the fire, looking at the fire behaviour, checking that it's in spec and it's in the prescription that you want. And if need be, they are the people who call the CFA or make the call to the captain or whoever to say, yeah, we're not happy with how this is going. We need help. We need support. Can you send somebody out? We're just not happy. And yeah, they're making that call. So if you're burning, sorry, I was just going to say, if you're going bigger than that, feel free to bring out as many people as possible. Like your ignition probably won't need it, but if you do want to go home reasonably early, having extra water and extra people to help black out and make sure that site is really safe, that's a blessing to have those extra resources if you've got them. Because as I said, you can get the burn doesn't take too long generally, but you can, I said, walk it really slowly and take it really slowly. But yeah, if you really want to make sure that site is, all out, 100%, good to walk away, having a few extra hands doesn't hurt.
And having someone to check it a few hours later when you're a bit buggered is probably a good idea as well. Greg's asked, can you send me a blank copy of your draft burn plan? I like checklists. Not sure whether you're able to do that.
Yeah, no worries, Greg. That's all good.
Yep. How often should an area be burned? Is there a rule of thumb, or is it just about what the grasses, etc., are looking like?
I wouldn't say there's a rule of thumb, but there is obviously some. There's definitely things you would look at. So in that grassland burn from that earlier slide, the intertussock space was completely closed over, and you might get a handful of lilies popping up in that space because it's really struggling to push through that thatch. It's also creating conditions where you might get fungal diseases. All the stuff you experience in your garden or your veggie patch can also happen out in the bush. So opening that up, increasing air movement at the ground level, and providing getting solar radiation down on that intertussock space is good. But growth rates vary from year to year. Some areas they hold too much moisture, so you don't get growth because your soils are saturated and plants just won't put on growth, or they could be too dry, so you're not getting a lot of growth. So you're looking at the connectivity of the fuels, how easily and how much curing you've got, and where you're at in your season. So in the curing, they talk about green phase or yellow phase in that, and you're talking about like the level of curing. You really need to avoid 100% curing, even though that was in the burn threshold, because that means there's just nothing in the plant, and it's going to be a very clean burn. So there would have to be a very clear ecological reason why you would burn when you had that level of curing. You really want to have a bit of colour in it to make sure that you've got some moisture in the plant holding it up. So yeah, as far as the question of like when and how, there's two things with plants. You've got like grasses, which are reshooting from tiller growth. and they're coming out from side growth going like this, whether they be tussocks or creeping grasses or stolon or whatever, they're moving sideways. Then you've got other plants which are rootstock regenerators, which you can burn the whole plant off and they'll just reshoot. So, you know, your Pymelias are a good example of that. They will burn right off and then they'll just reshoot from the rootstock. And then you've got plants that are seeders and that really need to get to maturity. So those are the ones I would focus on because they're the most vulnerable in any landscape. You really want to make sure, and then you've also got species which will lay down seed over years and years and years. So you really don't want to burn too frequently because you want to make sure that there's quite a good seed bank that's recovered in that space. But yeah, the ones that are vulnerable is like, you know, like think about it from a garden. You know, you've got fruit trees in your garden. What's your fruiting wood? There's a lot of plants obviously in your natural environment exactly the same. What are the flowering wood? Like it's got to put on maybe 3 or 4 years of growth, 5 years of growth, and then you probably want it to have a certain amount of seeding opportunities, and that might be variable over a couple of years. So you want to make sure it has a couple of opportunities where it can produce seed and then put that into the soil profile. One question that was raised in a forum I was once in is, what, you know, we think about mosaic and think, oh, I've got this small reserve, I've got to burn a patch and a patch and a patch and a patch, and that's a good thing. But if you've got a particularly significant species in that space, and if you're only burning 1/4 of its genetics each time, and it's cross-pollinating with 1/4 of its genetics, you're actually doing it a disservice. So understanding the species that are in your mix is really important because you might go, we'll actually need to burn this whole patch. We need it to stimulate it as much as possible. And I know that's a bit of there's probably a few people raising eyebrows around that because there's all these other factors, and there's always these other factors. Do you leave a refuge site or not? It's really about the context of when you're in. Is there refuge on the other side of the fence or not? Or do you just come and burn that orchid patch in one complete hit that you know that exists, really stimulate that patch, and then exclude that from the next burn? So that might be the focus of your ecological burn objective, is just to stimulate that one population to its maximum potential. Yeah, horses for courses, I suppose.
I wish to thank you, Marty, for your presentation, and we'll continue questions for those of you that have joined us. But for those watching the recording, thank you very much for watching the recording, and we hope that you've enjoyed this presentation by the Healthy Landscapes Practical Regenerative Farming program. Thanks.
So you want to keep